Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling a bit of a puzzle.
Hmm.
We've got a stack of sources here painting two, well, seemingly different pictures of the moment.
Right.
One looks at the hard economic numbers versus, how people actually feel about the economy.
Yeah, that disconnect.
And the other dives into a really specific, very current political debate that's happening right now in the Senate about government spending, social programs.
Yeah, big one.
So our mission, let's try and unpack this for you, pull out the important nuggets, and maybe see if there are some surprising links between these two things.
Sounds good. Where should we start?
Okay, let's dive in. How about that economic picture first? The analysis you mentioned points to something pretty fascinating with the data, right?
It really does. It makes this crucial distinction between what it calls soft data and hard data.
Okay, so soft data, that's like surveys, sentiment, confidence levels, expectations, kind of the fuzzier stuff.
Exactly. How people feel, what they think will happen. And then the hard data is, the tangible stuff, measurable outputs.
Like job numbers, production figures, sales,
Yeah.
things you can actually count.
Precisely. And what this analysis is showing is, well, a pretty significant gap opening up between those two right now. It seems to be growing.
A gap. How does that actually show up? What does it look like?
Well, the analysis points to things like Bloomberg's Soft Data Surprise Index.
Okay.
That index tracks how sentiment data comes in compared to forecasts. And lately, it's actually turned negative.
Negative meaning the mood is worse than analysts expected.
That's it. The feeling, the sentiment is below expectations. But at the same time, the Hard Data Surprise Index.
Which tracks the concrete numbers.
Right. That's actually stayed positive.
Yeah.
Things like, say, the labor market readings, they've been coming in better than predicted.
Huh. So you've got this odd situation. The official stats look relatively solid, maybe even better than expected.
Mm-hmm.
But the surveys, the mood on the ground, it feels weaker.
Exactly that. And the analysis does offer some reasons why this might be happening.
Like what?
It puts some of it down to ongoing factors like the trade policy uncertainty we've seen, the tariffs and that whole situation.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's hard to feel confident about making big plans if you don't quite know the rules of the game.
Right. And the analysis has some really good specific examples that bring this soft versus hard split to life. Take consumer confidence, for instance.
Okay.
The expectations part of that, from the conference board, it's actually a component of the index of leading economic indicators.
So it's considered pretty important for forecasting.
Very much so.
Mm-hmm.
And the analysis notes this expectations component saw a huge drop, 40 points from its peak after the last election.
Wow, 40 points just on expectations. That sounds like a big deal.
It is. And, the analysis points out that this plunge in sentiment kind of implied we'd see weaker real GDP growth.
And did we?
We did, yeah. First quarter, GDP came in slightly negative. So initially it looked like that soft data was, a pretty decent warning signal.
Okay, so soft data dips, signals a slowdown, hard data follows. That sounds logical. Where's the divergence then?
Here's where it gets really interesting, according to the source. The latest reading for May, for those consumer confidence expectations, it actually showed a pretty significant rebound from April.
So sentiment bounced back.
It did. It seems like that soft data is suddenly playing catch-up a bit, maybe aligning more with these stronger estimates that are now coming out for second quarter GDP.
So the soft data is maybe more volatile, less connected to the underlying trends sometimes?
That seems to be the implication here, yeah.
Okay.
It highlights that volatility. What about inflation? That's something everyone feels, right?
Definitely. How does that fit in?
Well, inflation's another really fascinating example of this gap, according to the analysis. It looks at the University of Michigan's Consumer Sentiment Survey.
Mm-hmm. They ask about inflation expectations?
They do, both short-term and longer-term. And the data shows those expected inflation numbers have spiked up recently.
So people think inflation is going higher or staying higher.
Exactly. They expect it to be higher, which is, well, it's in stark contrast to the actual core consumer price index.
The official measure?
Yeah, the actual core CPI has continued to trend lower year over year.
Whoa. So expected inflation is up, but actual measured inflation is down.
That's the disconnect, a pretty wide one.
That's quite something. Are there other examples in the analysis?
Yeah, it also looks at the misery index. Simple concept. Unemployment plus inflation.
Right.
The actual misery index has kept trending lower, mostly because unemployment's been low.
Okay, makes sense.
But the expected misery index, Using the UMix survey's expected unemployment and expected inflation, that shot up dramatically.
Ah, because of that spike in expected inflation.
Precisely. It's just another way to see how different the felt reality or the expected one can be from the measured numbers.
What about businesses? Small businesses especially, you'd think they'd be sensitive to this stuff.
Good question. The analysis looks at the NFIB survey, that's small business optimism. And it shows, well, a similar kind of pattern.
How so?
Optimism jumped right after the election. But since then, about half of that gain has reversed this year.
Okay.
And the analysis does note that NFIB data can sometimes have a bit of a political skew. And the recent big swings seem to be driven more by those soft components. The sentiment, the expectations.
Right, like that vibe session talk from a couple of years back,
Yeah.
where the feeling was recessionary, but the data wasn't quite there.
Exactly. The analysis specifically mentions that. It says back in 2022, the NFIB soft components plunged to all-time lows, like worse than during the global financial crisis.
Really? Worse than the GFC?
That's what the analysis says the soft components showed. But the hard components in that same survey, things like actual hiring plans or sales activity, they deteriorated, sure, but only fell to levels you'd see in prior slowdowns. They didn't match that massive plunge in sentiment.
So sentiment way overshot the actual activity slowdown.
It appears so. And the surge after the election showed the split too. Sentiment soared, but the hard activity measures just saw a bump, nowhere near the same scale. It really does seem to show how sentiment can, get ahead of itself or overreact.
So this pattern soft data being more jumpy, more reactive, and splitting off from the hard data, it seems pretty consistent across different ways of measuring things based on this source.
That's really the main takeaway here. The analysis keeps coming back to persistent uncertainty around trade policy.
The tariffs again.
Yeah, things like, what are the goals? What will the rates be? Which sectors get hit next? That kind of ongoing question mark is likely a big reason why confidence isn't really roaring back, even if we've had some pauses lately.
Does it look different regionally? Sometimes breaking it down gives you another angle.
It does touch on that. It uses the Philadelphia Fed's regional surveys. And in late May, their manufacturing index showed a sharp bounce.
Which is interesting since manufacturing is often right in the middle of tariff fights.
Right. But the services index and services are a much bigger chunk of the economy. Remember, that barely moved up at all. And both indexes were still actually in contraction territory.
Meaning activity was still shrinking in the region, according to the surveys.
Correct. Still declining. And, weakness in services is potentially more worrying just given the size of that sector in the U.S. economy.
Yeah, absolutely. The U.S. has a services surplus. It's the bulk of GDP.
Exactly. So weakness there could have wider ripples. And the Philly Fed survey also had this special question this month that the analysis highlights. It's really relevant to that inflation perception thing we talked about.
Yeah. What did they ask?
They asked businesses if their customers had become less price sensitive.
Okay. And
0% said yes.
zero. None.
None. 0% said customers were less price sensitive. And on the flip side, half the businesses said their customers had become more price sensitive.
Wow. That's pretty stark.
It really is. And the analysis notes, this is a reminder that for regular people, inflation isn't just some abstract number economists track month to month.
No, it's how much did this cost last time?
Exactly. It's psychological. It's about that price comparison, that volatility. And anxiety over that is probably putting real downward pressure on the soft data, on how people feel, maybe more than the headline inflation rate itself would suggest.
How are, say, financial markets digesting all this? Does the analysis touch on company earnings or analyst views?
It does, yeah. It looks at analysts' expectations for corporate earnings. And it says, given all this policy uncertainty, especially tariffs, you've seen a rising number of S&P 500 companies either pull their future earnings guidance altogether or lower it.
So companies are being cautious about predicting the future.
Seems like it. And this has caused a decline in the earnings revision ratio that tracks how analysts are changing their forecasts. They're becoming more pessimistic generally.
But haven't actual earnings been okay recently? Reasonably strong.
Yes. According to the analysis, actual earnings growth has been trending higher, looking through the first quarter of 2025 anyway. But the analysts, they haven't really extrapolated that strength forward.
So they see the recent good results, but maybe because of the company warnings and the uncertainty, they're hesitant to predict it'll continue.
That seems to be the dynamic, yeah. So wrapping up this whole economic piece,
Yeah.
the analysis really hammers home that policy uncertainty, particularly what it calls the mercurial nature of trade policy, is likely a key factor keeping expectations and sentiment kind of shaky.
Hmm.
The source concludes that, businesses can adapt, they're nimble, but the real problem is not knowing the rules of the game.
Right. Predictability matters.
Immensely. So the analysis suggests if we get more clarity, maybe soft data catches up to the hard data. But if we don't, it's probably more likely the hard data eventually catches down to the weak sentiment.
So view that soft data as a potential early warning.
That's how this source frames it. Yes, a crucial early warning system.
Okay, that gives us a really clear sense of that economic puzzle and the potential role policy uncertainty plays.
Now, let's pivot. Let's look at our second source, which gives us a window into a very specific, very timely policy debate happening right now.
Right, this one takes us straight to Washington, focusing on comments from Pennsylvania Senator Dave McCormick.
Okay.
It's about a big budget bill. It just barely passed the House. And the source notes that everyone expects changes as it goes to the Senate.
And the politics are pretty clear-cut, at least on the House side for PA reps.
Yes. The source mentions that Pennsylvania Democrats in the House all voted against it, while all the state's Republican lawmakers voted for it.
Okay. And what did Senator McCormick say?
Well, speaking on TV, the source quotes him saying, "It's pretty clear there's been out-of-control spending in a Medicaid program." And he feels the bill can be improved in the Senate by adding more fiscal restraint. That's his goal.
And how are Democrats framing this push for fiscal restraint? What's their take, according to the source? Well, according to the article, Democrats are warning that the Republican aim here is to make pretty substantial cuts to big social safety net programs.
Like Medicaid, which McCormick mentioned.
Exactly. Medicaid and also SNAP, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, often called food stamps. Democrats warn the goal is to slash these programs to pay for tax cuts elsewhere, potentially for wealthier individuals or corporations.
Does the source mention the scale of cuts Democrats are warning about?
It does. They're talking about potential cuts close to $900 billion from Medicaid over 10 years and nearly $300 billion from SNAP over the same period.
Those are significant numbers.
They are. And the source quotes Pennsylvania's other senator, John Fetterman, who's a Democrat, saying he flat out won't vote for the bill because of the impact on these assistance programs.
Okay, so you have the different political perspectives. Does the source bring in any, nonpartisan context on the kind of cuts needed for major savings?
It does, yeah. It references the Congressional Budget Office, the CBO.
Yeah.
They're the nonpartisan scorekeepers. And a CBO report back in March apparently stated that if you wanted to cut federal budget costs by around $880 billion over 10 years, a number similar to the Medicaid figure being discussed, it would be basically impossible without making cuts to big programs like Medicaid, Medicare, or the Children's Health Insurance Program.
So the CBO perspective seems to align with the idea that achieving savings of that magnitude would almost certainly involve these major programs.
It provides that nonpartisan context for the scale, yes. It suggests that finding hundreds of billions in savings without touching those large entitlement programs is, well, very difficult.
Okay. Getting back to Senator McCormick's specific points on Medicaid, he did say the goal is protection for some groups.
Yes, the source quotes him saying the goal is to ensure that the vulnerable people for whom this program was designed are protected and those benefits are protected.
But he also specified groups he thinks should not be covered.
He did. The source quotes him saying, "For able-bodied working men without dependents or for illegal immigrants, we want to eliminate that expense. That's not what the program was designed for."
So that defines a specific area where he sees potential savings or eligibility changes.
From his perspective, yes. It targets those specific groups for potential exclusion or stricter requirements.
Now, the source also brings in info from the state agency that actually runs these programs in Pennsylvania, right? The Department of Human Services.
Yes, PADHS. And this gives some useful context on how things currently work, how they check eligibility, and try to prevent fraud.
What does it say they do?
According to PAGHS, they check income and household details against a whole bunch of databases, state and federal. Things like the State Department of Labor and Industry, Social Security Administration, and importantly, given the senator's comments, immigration databases to check citizenship and residency status.
So they explicitly check immigration status currently. What else?
They also cross-check with the IRS, the state tax department, other public assistance agencies, even the state lottery and the Department of Health. Sounds like a pretty thorough vetting process.
And what about catching fraud or improper payments? What does the source say about their efforts there?
It mentions the PADHS Office of Inspector General investigated over 19,000 applications just in the last fiscal year.
19,000.
Yeah, and it says the vast majority of those investigations came from referrals within the human services system itself, like caseworkers flagging issues.
Okay.
And they have a specific unit, the Bureau of Program Integrity, focused just on Medicaid fraud. They even use, apparently, an AI system for fraud detection, looking for outliers. And they work with the state attorney general on cases.
Did they mention any results from these efforts? Any actual savings found?
They did. For the 2023-24 fiscal year, PADHS reported removing 325 providers from the Medicaid program for cause, things like fraud or abuse. And they estimate that saved nearly $34 million.
Okay, so the source provides that context.
Yes.
There's an ongoing effort within the existing system to ensure program integrity and find savings, alongside this political debate about broader changes to spending and eligibility.
Exactly. It paints a picture of the current operational checks and balances.
Right. So let's step back. We've looked at these two distinct areas from our sources. We have this confusing economic picture, weak feelings, okay-ish, hard data, with policy uncertainty looming large. And then we have this very real, very current political fight over government spending, fiscal restraint, and who qualifies for major safety net programs like Medicaid.
Yeah. So now let's try to connect them. What happens when you put these side by side?
Well, one source tells us policy uncertainty dampens confidence, right?
Right. A key theme.
And the other source gives us a perfect live example of exactly that kind of high-stakes policy uncertainty playing out right now. And it's about fundamental things, spending, safety nets.
It really is uncertainty in action, isn't it? And could there be a more direct link? You mentioned that Philly Fed survey finding people are highly sensitive to prices right now.
Yeah, 0% feeling customers are less price sensitive, half feeling they're more sensitive.
So if people are already feeling squeezed by costs, could the debate about potentially cutting assistance programs designed to help with those very costs make them feel even more anxious? Could that feed directly into the negative sentiment the soft data is picking up?
That seems plausible, doesn't it? If you're worried about making ends meet, hearing about potential cuts to food assistance or healthcare assistance, well, that's likely to increase anxiety, not reduce it. It could definitely contribute to that weak feeling about the economy.
It connects the psychological impact of perceived inflation with the psychological impact of policy uncertainty around support systems.
And what about the uncertainty itself? Just the political fighting back and forth. Regardless of the final outcome of this Senate bill, how much does the process, the prolonged debate, the headlines, the arguments contribute to the kind of uncertainty that the economic analysis said weighs down confidence?
That's a really important point. The economic analysis stressed that a lack of clarity on the rules of the game is the drag. Well, a public, often quite heated debate about the future rules for major government programs creates a period of intense uncertainty about those rules. It seems very likely that the stress and unpredictability of the debate itself could be hitting sentiment, hitting confidence, even before any changes are actually made.
So the debate itself becomes an economic factor.
Quite possibly, yeah. It contributes to that atmosphere of unpredictability that businesses and consumers seem to dislike so much, according to the first source.
Okay, so that first source suggested soft data is like an early warning system. Are these weak sentiment signals? We're seeing warnings about the potential future impact if these debated policy changes actually happen.
That's one possibility.
Or are they more just reflecting the current stress and anxiety caused by the uncertainty of the debate itself?
It's probably, some complex mix of both, realistically. The sources don't give us a definitive answer there, but they definitely make you think about it. Is the sentiment predicting a future hit from policy changes? Or is it reflecting a current hit from policy uncertainty? It's a really critical distinction to consider.
Absolutely. So we've taken a deep dive today into, well, two really fascinating areas, this puzzling gap between the economic numbers and the economic mood.
The hard versus soft data story.
And this very pointed, very current political debate over government spending and the future of crucial assistance programs.
And understanding both the data points and the different viewpoints in that policy debate feels really key right now, doesn't it? To just being well informed.
Definitely. These aren't just headlines. They really touch on how we measure economic health and the big choices being made about government's role.
And looking at them together, like we did, reveals these potential connections, how policy debates might directly impact economic sentiment, for example, that you might miss otherwise.
Okay, so here's a final, maybe provocative thought for you to chew on as you go about your day. If consumer confidence, if expectations are as sensitive as that first analysis suggested, sensitive to policy uncertainty, sensitive to feeling squeezed by prices,
Hmm.
does the very act of having a prolonged, very public political fight over these fundamental economic programs become a significant economic headwind in itself? Could the disagreement itself impact sentiment, impact behavior, even before a single law is changed? What does that tell us about the interplay between politics, perception, and the economy?